Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Africa editor, Financial Times, William Wallace, along with today's panel concerning the rise of Africa.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Just a quick point of order before we get started. During the course of this debate we're about to have, and indeed through the next 3 days' discussion, we want the audience to participate as much as possible. And to do this, you will be able to interact through your telephones. If you have a smartphone, you can dial into the website, which I hope is going to appear behind us at some point. Alternatively, with another kind of phone, you can text in questions, and these will miraculously appear in front of me on this iPad, I hope. Well, we're going to be discussing and debating for the next little bit whether this narrative of Africa rising out of the lost decades of the 80s and 90s and finally beginning to fulfill its potential is a myth or reality. And it's true that in the last decade, Africa's growth rates, nudging 6%, have compared favorably both to the continents historically, but also to other parts of the world. It's also true that there's a big gap still between the perception of risk on the continent and the reality of returns that businesses are making. And in that gap, I think a lot of people are making money. But is this growth and is the money that is flowing into the continent, is this translating into measurable improvements for African citizens? And if it isn't, can we believe that this narrative of Africa rising is going to be sustainable? So here to discuss these issues with me are Abdul Salam Aizoun, who's the chairman of Maroc Telecom and the former telecommunications minister in Morocco. We have Colin Coleman to his right. He's the managing director of Goldman Sachs in South Africa. Shanta Devarajan, the chief economist for Africa at the World Bank. And Henri Oyima, who's the managing director of BGFI Bank here in Gabon. Ariane de Rothschild from Edmond de Rothschild Holding. And Amin Tazi Rifi from McKinsey, the consultancy. Can I start first with you, Amin? You contributed to setting the tone a little bit on this narrative of Africa rising with your report 2 years ago, Lions on the Move. Could you give us a little outline of what made you create this report and what are the main contributors to these new perceptions of Africa's potential?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having us here today. Maybe I should start with the triggers for that report. Actually, there were really two. The first one was the surprising growth that we were actually having on the continent. We were actually very surprised. We started in 2000 and basically everything blossomed. And there were a lot of questions internally about, is this just like the 70s, like the last commodity boom? Is this going to last? So there were, let's say, internal questions. We also were having more and more questions from governments, from some of the multinationals, really asking us pretty much the same questions. So we decided to put together a team that could bring objectivity to the whole thing. First, by bringing some macroeconomists, the same people that had analyzed the growth in India, China, or Latin America, some sector specialists of the most important sectors, as well as people like myself who are spending most of our time actually trying to support Africa in, let's say, concretely on the terrain. And what came out of this was actually a fairly clear picture. The first thing is the fact that when we actually analyzed the growth of Africa, it was a fairly general movement. 28 out of the 30 top economies were growing much faster than in the past. Second, that it was basically all sectors, not necessarily the sectors that we thought, mostly driven by the sectors that are consumer-facing, not necessarily the commodity boom. We could explain only 30% of the acceleration of the growth in the new decade through the commodity boom. What was also very surprising was that the role of the states, in good French, because we have to say this in French, le retour des États, the fact that there's a lot more fiscal power, plus 70%, and that the states are playing a much more active role in shaping basically the growth of the continent, as we've heard a bit earlier by the President of the Republic of Gabon. So first thing is that this growth is much more than a commodity boom. The second big thing that came out of our analysis is that the underlying growth drivers behind this acceleration are really here to stay. If you think about high prices, I think the good old days of cheap commodities are gone. The way, basically, we are developing those resources, which much more integrated approaches to infrastructure, to corporate social responsibility, and the way we actually develop that, this has shifted tremendously, and we believe that those are elastic trends that are going to be there to stay. And if you add to this, obviously, the favorable terrain of urbanization and demography, there are very good reasons to believe that the growth corridor of Africa, despite the accidents we may have here and there, is really here to stay. We believe that this growth is robust. Of course, the way you go about it needs to be innovative, needs to also take a longer time horizon. It's not about doing a quick buck, it's about investing, it's about building out the human resources platforms to really be in a position to develop it, but that those growth trajectories are really here to stay.
Minister, you have been involved for a long time in one of the sectors, telecommunications, that's contributed most to the growth story of the last 10 years. Do you think, and in that sector, governments have tended to get regulation right, and the private sector has moved in and taken advantage. Do you think that the success that has occurred in telecoms can be repeated in other sectors?
D'abord, plus généralement, la croissance africaine, elle est là, elle est concrète, elle est très forte, elle est durable. Et même, comment dirais-je, la crise actuelle économique mondiale n'a pas atteint la croissance africaine. Ça veut dire qu'il s'agit là d'une croissance ancrée et aucune conjoncture ne peut l'atteindre en ce moment. Et nous, en tant qu'opérateurs, acteurs en Afrique, nous avons pu le vérifier et en plus en récolter les fruits. Parce que là où nous sommes dans 5 pays africains. Je ne suis peut-être pas le modèle attendu puisque c'est un opérateur africain qui investit en Afrique. Mais là où nous avons été, nous avons, avec le soutien des ressources humaines locales, et que par les ressources humaines locales, pu moderniser ces entreprises et les faire passer d'entreprises subventionnées par les États, c'est-à-dire l'argent du contribuable, à des entreprises hautement rentables, pas seulement rentables, hautement rentables, et qui en plus connaissent une croissance bien supérieure à la croissance économique du continent. La moyenne de notre croissance dans les pays africains dans lesquels nous sommes présents est de 20%. C'est vous dire à quel point ce que cherche un investisseur, et là je m'adresse à mes pairs européens, occidentaux et asiatiques, on cherche de la croissance, elle est là. On cherche des marchés, elle est là. On cherche de la compétitivité, elle est là. Et quand je vois le débat en Europe sur les délocalisations, ça me fait sourire. Parce que délocaliser, ça veut dire en fait améliorer la compétitivité de l'entreprise qui délocalise. Sinon, eh ben, l'entreprise ne sera pas compétitive et par conséquent, elle risque d'être condamnée à terme. Et par conséquent, la destruction d'emplois dans le pays d'origine. Je fais mienne tous les cris de cœur qui ont été lancés tout à l'heure par Son Excellence le Président Ali Bongo Ondimba et en fait, et aussi le Président Yahya Boni. Et en fait, le message que nous voulons faire passer à nous, Africains, ne venez pas nous voir avec des lunettes de l'Afrique qui a faim, l'Afrique qui a soif, l'Afrique c'est des risques, c'est de l'insécurité. Ça n'est pas vrai tout ça. Ça l'est, effectivement, en partie. Mais l'Afrique, c'est aussi des chefs d'entreprise, c'est des entreprises, c'est des entrepreneurs, c'est des cadres supérieurs, compétents, qualifiés, qui n'ont rien à envier aux cadres des entreprises dans les pays du Nord. Et donc, mon appel, c'est effectivement de faire confiance, mais il faut venir sans parti pris, sans se dire que si j'y vais, il va m'arriver ceci, je vais prendre des risques, etc., etc. Peut-être que ce qui m'a aidé psychologiquement, c'est que je viens d'un pays où j'entends la même chose des investisseurs qui viennent d'ailleurs. Alors je me dis, moi je suis en Afrique, je suis chez moi, je ne vais pas m'encombrer avec des concepts comme ceux-là qui sont en fait, qui inhibent l'initiative et qui dressent des obstacles devant l'initiative.
Following on from that, Colin Coleman, if you look at the returns that investors can expect in the US and Europe, they're pretty dismal at the moment. The returns they might expect in Africa tend to be much, much better. Is that translating into increased flows of capital and increased flows of FDI, or are we still seeing flights to safety and in fact, Africa is not benefiting as much as it might?
There's no doubt that the winds of change are behind the back of Africa. And to answer specifically your question, give it some numbers, if you ask the private equity community who've been investing in Africa for the last 20 years, they have experienced 30% dollar internal rates of return over that period of investment. Now, whether that can sustain, because we've come off a very low base, is the critical question. But as the global system goes through a rebalancing, and clearly, if you listen to what Muhammad Yunus had to say, I must say we should all applaud his initiatives and his contribution because it speaks a lot to what is required in the global rebalancing. I do believe that when you look at the transformations that have been going on, there are some very fundamental shifts going on in the world. And Africa is very much at the beginning of its major role in this process. To be specific, I think when you look at Africa, and Africa is 53 countries that differ significantly between them. Some of the positives, 1.2 billion people across the continent. Now that's about the size of India today. So the truth is it's not that big a population, but it's a substantial population. The GDP of Africa is now around $2 trillion, which is a similar size to India or to Russia. And the market capitalization of Africa is about $1.5 trillion, of which half is South Africa alone. And that tells you that we are starting off a relatively low base, but with good promise. What are the problems? The problems are we don't really have, outside of South Africa itself, liquid capital markets, neither a debt capital market or an equity capital market that's functioning. So investors who want to participate don't have that degree of liquidity that they'll look for. So it's very important that the role of private equity, the role of Chinese money, the role of multinational investments help create those equity capital markets, number one. Number two is there is a huge amount of constraints in terms of regulatory institutions. They're relatively weak institutions, and we have to strengthen those. If you cast your mind back to China, for example, in the 1980s, they really didn't have a capital market, but they created capital markets, and the role of the state was to help push the creation of capital markets and corporates that could unleash economic activity. And so I think it's not a dissimilar analogy to say Africa today is where China was 30 years ago, and the promise of Africa ahead is not dissimilar. So when we look at the Jim O'Neill analysis of BRICS, looking forward 30 years to 2050, we estimate that Africa should have a GDP from $2 trillion today of $14 trillion in 2050. A place like Nigeria will be close on $4 trillion if they just do the basic things right. We don't have to outperform, we don't have to create magic. It's just simple maths of 150 million people in Nigeria growing at 7% GDP per annum. You will get an economy of that sort of size. And if you just take a step back and say, in the last 10 years, one example, MTN Nigeria created a business from nothing They now have 45 million subscribers, 45% EBITDA margins in that country, and the equity value of what they've created is somewhere near $15 billion in the market capitalization of MTN. So that's an incredible creation of a business that is servicing a market that basically didn't have telecommunications. And that is the kind of opportunity that exists all around Africa.
I remember when Nigeria was first launching its GSM auctioning process, some of the European companies looking at it thought the potential was only for 5 million subscribers, and there's now 80 million plus.
Yeah, I mean, it really has, in many ways, proven that companies that are prepared to take the risk on Africa have time and time again got their returns.
Ariane de Rothschild, you're involved in private equity in Africa, which is a big place, and there are 54 different countries, very divergent, many different sectors to look at. How do you decide what you're going to invest in?
We first, I will have a general remark in response to what was said earlier. I think some capital goes to secure places, and other capital goes to less secure places. So family-wise, we've always gone to less secure places. In terms of Africa, what's very important for us is to choose countries that are at the beginning of the curve of a consumer market. Because we as investors are less interested in countries driven too much by natural resources. And one of our roles as private equitors is also to accompany, because in an answer to what Mohamed Yunus said, I think where investment today is also interesting, is not only to expect a financial return, but also demand social and environmental return. And in terms of governance, I think I felt very strongly that it's up to us also to impose to ourselves specific governance, because the rates of return are so high. One, that you can afford to demand more in your investments, and second, it's proven that socially responsible investments have had higher returns. So we will look for those countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, that are really at the beginning of a consumer curve, because that's what we want to accompany.
Mr. Oyema, if you go around the continent, people criticize banks often in Africa for different reasons, and they criticize them elsewhere in the world. But they tend to complain that banks have been very cautious in their investments and have failed to invest in productive sectors of economies where jobs are created. Do you think that's beginning to change?
Je crois qu'aujourd'hui, l'assertion selon laquelle les banques n'accompagnent pas le monde économique est faux, dans la mesure où aujourd'hui nous avons, pour parler de quelques exemples précis, je peux évoquer le groupe qui est le mien, dans la mesure où aujourd'hui nous sommes partis d'une banque mono-pays, nous sommes aujourd'hui multi-pays, partis d'un métier de la banque des entreprises simples, nous sommes aujourd'hui sur plusieurs métiers, et qu'aujourd'hui nous finançons beaucoup d'entreprises et finançons l'économie réelle. Et d'ailleurs, il ne vous a pas échappé que lorsque la crise de 2008 est intervenue, la plupart des banques africaines n'ont pas souffert. C'est-à-dire que nous finançons aujourd'hui l'économie réelle et aujourd'hui nous avons la possibilité et les moyens nécessaires dans les analyses pour accompagner à la fois les institutionnels, nos États, mais aussi les entreprises dans le financement des investissements. Donc aujourd'hui, nous pouvons dire que tous les investisseurs qui sont intéressés par le Gabon et par l'Afrique en général, que nous avons aujourd'hui des institutions solides et capables d'accompagner tous les projets d'investissement des entreprises.
Shanta Devarajan, all this talk of Africa rising and the broad picture that, for example, McKinsey has painted with the big numbers, is not really being felt by the average African citizen, is it? And if it isn't, and if this growth we're seeing is not trickling down and is not measurably decreasing poverty, then can we really talk about a continent emerging?
Oh, I think this growth is reducing poverty, and it's reducing poverty at a very rapid clip. In fact, poverty rose in Africa when growth was very low. And since 1995, the poverty rate, that's the percentage of people living on $1.25 a day, has been falling at faster than 1 percentage point a year. Now, keep in mind, that's a faster rate of poverty reduction than India. And we talk about India being the shining star. Furthermore, for the first time, the absolute number of people in poverty is falling. So between 2005 and 2008, 9 million Africans were lifted out of poverty. That's the population of Benin. And the other thing that's quite remarkable is we're seeing rapid improvements in the human development indicators. Child mortality is falling in about a dozen countries, is falling faster in those dozen African countries than it did during the peak decline in child mortality in China or Korea. So this is trickling down. Now, the point is that it's very hard because it's still the case that 50% or 47% to be exact of Africans live on $1.25 a day. So, we're not done yet, not even close.
And for those people, what do you think matters most? A growth rate of, say, 6% GDP or an increase in food prices of maybe 50%?
No, I think what really matters, first of all, 70% of those people are in agriculture. So what matters for them is increases in productivity of agriculture. Now, an increase in food prices can actually be beneficial if that increase in food prices is translated into returns to farmers, to smallholder farmers, which isn't always the case. Secondly, I think what matters most to these people is getting a basic education and getting improvements in their health. This will enable them eventually to move out of agriculture, move out of the informal sector, and get jobs in the formal sector. But at the same time, we need to be creating those jobs in the formal sector, which then gets to the points that the President was talking about earlier as well. We need infrastructure, we need improvements in the business climate, and we need the access to finance.
We've got some questions now coming in from the audience. One for you, perhaps, Amin. Which route is best for growth in Africa? Each nation choosing its own individual path or through cooperation with neighboring countries?
Je pense que c'est assez difficile de généraliser. Je pense qu'il y a clairement un déficit d'intégration régionale et que ça a été, d'ailleurs que ce soit au niveau des infrastructures ou d'autres types d'infrastructures, comme par exemple les infrastructures financières, le fait qu'on n'ait pas d'intégration nous pénalise très clairement. Néanmoins, je dirais que chaque pays peut aujourd'hui bénéficier de ces mêmes vents favorables de la même manière et surtout je dirais, s'inspirer des modèles qui ont été développés ailleurs. Ce qui est assez étonnant, c'est qu'on a repris à peu près une quinzaine de secteurs, que ce soit des secteurs très sociaux comme l'éducation ou la santé, que ce soit des secteurs à cheval entre l'économie et le social comme l'agriculture, ou des secteurs qui sont très fortement liés à l'international ou au secteur industriel par exemple. Et on se rend compte que partout on commence à voir les ébauches de success stories. Alors, évidemment, dans le développement économique, 10 ans, ce n'est rien. Mais on commence à avoir des modèles qui fonctionnent. Et il n'y a rien de plus important dans le développement de l'acte fondamental qui est celui de l'investissement que d'avoir des preuves concrètes sur la base de choses qui se sont déjà passées ailleurs. Je pense qu'un des éléments essentiels de la coopération, c'est simplement déjà cet échange d'expériences et le fait de réaliser qu'un investissement qui va mal dans un pays peut avoir une contagion très négative partout ailleurs.
Another one from the audience. How do we get this growth to trickle down to food on the table for the poor? It's something we've just spoken about a bit, but clearly even if the proportion of people living in poverty is going down, there's still very large numbers of people who are poor, and in some countries the numbers are actually going up.
I guess it's aimed at me. Yes. Yes, no, I think it's a very good question. Part of the answer is trying to increase agricultural productivity, so the farmers are actually producing more food. But the other is that people have the means with which to buy food when food prices go up. And there's also been quite a lot of progress. It used to be the case that when food prices went up, they would introduce price controls. And these backfired. They actually ended up making the poor worse off because they're the ones who missed out on the food. Today, about 13 African countries have safety net programs. These are programs that give cash transfers to poor people. They're targeted at poor people. And actually, for instance, in Ethiopia, they have a very successful safety net programs called productive safety nets. And when the food crisis hit, when food prices spiked, they just increased the amount of money they give to the poor, and they didn't touch the food prices themselves. They just let them buy food at higher prices. So there are ways that we have now learned that are more efficient at getting food on the table.
I was looking during a previous discussion at the picture behind me, and it had the Economist cover, Africa Rising, which was a response to a cover 10 years ago which called Africa the hopeless continent. Is this not a bit of an oversimplification of the case both ways? Because they looked very stupid 10 years ago, perhaps, when they said Africa was a hopeless continent and you got 10 years of growth. Is there not a danger that we're oversimplifying the case yet again? What do you think, Mr. Coleman?
I think it's correct. I think it's correct that it's oversimplification in both directions, but directionally it's correct, which means I think that broadly speaking, Africa is rising. Now I say broadly speaking because there are some contraindications. So in respect of the previous question, for example, if you speak on the ground to Nigerians, their biggest cost in a business that they want to create, in a small micro-enterprise business, and we have a program called 10,000 Women, where we interact with these businesswomen, we understand what is going on in the costs inputs into the businesses. They will answer that the lack of power generation means that they have to use diesel-generated power, which is the most expensive form of power. And it is actually a very high percentage of their costs in their business and really affects their profit margins. So their ability to actually create businesses that work are a function of the lack of ability for that country to actually get their power generation in a proper way. And the reason you've got to ask is, why is it that in, for example, Nigeria, where there's effectively 1/5 of the amount of power relative to the economy that there is in other countries, why is it that they can't build the power supply? And it goes to some questions around institutional arrangements, willingness, political will of the government to deal with those that are benefiting from the diesel arrangement that is there, and putting in place proper systems where they can attract private interest in power generation. And so I think there's a complex set of questions. Yes, it's directionally going in the right way, but the governments have to be held accountable for making sure that this direction accelerates.
Do you think that governments in general are doing enough to improve the business climate? Could they not be doing a lot more? For example, the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report annually has dozens of African countries near the bottom, even if some African countries have risen very, very fast up it.
Well, let's be clear. If Europe had the fiscal ratios that Africa has, the world would be in a much better place. And so there's a lot that Europe could learn from Africa's orthodoxy in respect of the IMF, World Bank business models or economic models. And so, it's absolutely true that Africa has done a whole bunch of things in the right direction. But a lot more can be done. And the governments have to accelerate the development of institutions that not only create policy, but execute on policy, execute on its infrastructure build program, and those things are absolutely vital. I think the role of the Chinese, coming back to an earlier question on this, is that they have actually been very, very helpful to building infrastructure on the ground in these countries with a mixed result. But broadly speaking, they're actually helping oil and facilitate the building of infrastructure in Africa.
We've got lots more questions coming in from the audience. Why does the panel think that Africa has been resilient to the economic crisis, and when the West recovers, will Africa's growth decline in response? Maybe you, Ariane.
What's very interesting about Africa It's living the opposite that you have in Europe. I think Europe is going through heavy structural problems, and the opposite, Africa is building its structural economy. So it's not a changement conjoncturel, c'est un changement structurel, and that's very important to answer your question about how strong this growth is going to be. Is it going to be a sustainable growth? Per se, yes, because one, we're coming from a very low level, and it's a structural change. I think it was very important that the Chinese gave this strong push to develop the economy, and it's interesting to see, like President Ali Bongo said, you have now in foreign direct investments, you have the Indians, you have many more countries moving in, and what's also very interesting to see is you have intra-Africa investment, and I think that should be encouraged. It's very interesting to see how Morocco, for example, is investing. I was discussing with somebody in social housing in Gabon. To rebound on banking, there's an amazing growth in African banks, Moroccan banks, Gabonese banks, South African banks. So I think they will really, encourage the move towards the sustainable economy.
Just to add one point about the second half of that question, which is, if Europe recovers, will Africa suffer? On the contrary, it's exactly the opposite. Africa will benefit from a recovery in Europe, and in particular, a recovery or increased growth in China and India, because the other thing we're noticing is that China is becoming a very expensive place to do light manufacturing. And so some of my colleagues have estimated that something like 85 million jobs are likely to leave China. And those could end up in Africa, as some of them are already. There's factories in producing shoes and clothing in Ethiopia that have a huge potential. So we want to keep those wages rising in China so that the jobs will move to Africa.
What are the sort of things that keep you up as businessmen at night in terms of how this whole growth story might come crashing down in some places? What are the things that worry you?
D'abord, il y a eu la confiance résultant des politiques économiques dans le secteur des télécommunications qui ont été menées depuis une décennie. La quasi-totalité des pays africains ont mené des politiques de libéralisation et de privatisation des télécommunications avec des cadres réglementaires clairs, transparents, menés par des régulateurs dont on attend plus d'indépendance et plus de compétences. Et le résultat, c'est que sur 10 années, le nombre d'abonnés mobiles en Afrique est passé de 10 millions à 600 millions. Mais à 600 millions, ça ne fait que 60% d'équipement de la population africaine. Dans les autres régions du monde, très souvent, ce taux d'équipement dépasse les 100%. Et ici même au Gabon, le taux d'équipement est de 115%. C'est pour vous dire qu'il y a des disparités, mais que pour l'investissement, il y a encore beaucoup de chemin à faire, il y a beaucoup d'efforts d'investissement à faire. Ce qui attire l'investisseur, c'est de s'assurer réellement que le cadre réglementaire est transparent. C'est la première condition. La deuxième, c'est que les juges, les arbitres, que ce soit les autorités de concurrence ou de régulation, doivent être compétents et indépendants. Malheureusement, sur ce deuxième point, on n'est pas souvent à la rencontre de cette condition. Mais généralement, quand on voit le succès formidable des télécommunications en Afrique, on peut dire que ça n'a pas constitué un frein. Plus généralement, dans d'autres secteurs de l'économie, on n'a pas le choix que de poursuivre des programmes de réformes structurelles sur toute l'économie. Et à mon avis, c'est ce qui a permis à l'Afrique décoller. Maintenant, on est optimiste, comme vous le disiez tout à l'heure. Mais je pense que si on continue sur cette voie, le train de la croissance de l'Afrique ne s'arrêtera pas.
We've seen, for example, real improvements in macroeconomic management in Africa over the past 2 decades. And that's obviously delivered some real results. But are we seeing that kind of improvement in other areas of governance across the continent? And are we seeing results in other sectors?
No, I think to rebound on what keeps us awake at night, I think if you invest in Africa, you have to have a long-term vision. That's the first condition. So that really is the first condition. And to be sure you invest long-term, you want political stability. You want regulation. You want also a depth of market, because at some point, it's very difficult to have European or American investors invest in a fund when you are telling them they will only maybe get out in 15 years. So you need market, you need to open up the markets, you need this depth that Colin was talking about, and stability. And it's true, I think you have to encourage intra-country in Africa, intra-country trade, to solidify this growth, because you want growth to come from Africa. And I think that what encourages it is foreign direct investment, as well as the move of multinationals in a more significant way in Africa will accompany this change. But you need the stability. And we're seeing it in most of Africa.
If I can just make a comment, I think we've also got to be careful to just dig in a little bit as to what is Africa, because we've been talking on aggregate about Africa, but Africa is at various stages of development depending on the country. So a place like South Africa is obviously a very sophisticated financial market. A place like Nigeria is a very deep consumer market, and a place like Angola is effectively an oil economy that is beginning to develop a services economy around the oil. And so many of these countries are at very different stages of development. A place like the DRC, which is blessed with huge amounts of copper resources, for example, is very difficult to do business on in respect of various governance measures that you would normally adopt. But various people have been doing successful business there. And we advise, for example, a Chinese company that bought a South African listed firm called Metarex. It has operations in the DRC and in Zambia. It was successfully executed. It was done in partnership with the various authorities, and it can happen. But the only point I'm making, I guess, is that we must be careful not to simplify what Africa looks like. It's very different depending on the local conditions in these countries.
We've got an absolute flood of questions coming in from the audience now, so I better take some of them. Why do African governments make as much? Why do they not make as much effort? No. Why do African governments make as much effort to seduce foreign investors? What efforts are they making for private local entrepreneurship? Amin, perhaps you could have a go at that one.
En quelque part, cette question revient assez régulièrement. Au final, lorsqu'on crée un environnement qui est favorable à l'investissement, finalement, l'investissement n'a pas vraiment de couleur. Et au final, si on réussit à créer un environnement qui est favorable, il peut bénéficier finalement à tout le monde. Je ne pense pas qu'on doit absolument opposer investissement direct étranger notamment et investissement local. En général, c'est l'un qui peut amener l'autre. Je pense qu'il y a un rôle de catalyse très important qu'on voit notamment lorsqu'on prend une perspective de 10 ans, parce que le fait d'arriver avec de l'argent qui est intelligent, qui vient avec des systèmes managériaux plus sophistiqués, permet finalement d'essaimer, pas uniquement par ce qu'on peut avoir comme impact indirect sur le tissu de fournisseurs, mais aussi parce que ça forme toute une génération de managers qui, eux, peuvent aller faire d'autres choses. Je pense qu'il ne faut absolument pas les opposer. Il faut avoir des environnements qui soient favorables à l'investissement, d'où qu'ils viennent. Et dans certains secteurs, je pense qu'il y a encore un énorme travail à faire et où le capital africain a un rôle absolument fondamental à jouer. Je pense à 2 secteurs notamment, à le secteur de l'agriculture. On voit partout, pour moi, c'est une des choses me font, je dirais, qui me préoccupent, c'est toute cette énergie aujourd'hui qu'on voit autour de l'agriculture africaine. Il y a beaucoup, beaucoup d'intérêt, mais on ne voit pas encore assez de transactions, on ne voit pas encore assez de deals, on ne voit pas encore assez de modèles, de véhicules qui permettent à tout cet argent, tout cet intérêt international de venir sur le terrain. Je ne vois pas comment un international pourra le faire sans impliquer le capital local, sans impliquer la compétence locale et les intérêts locaux pour pouvoir vraiment le faire. Même chose sur l'habitat social. Ce sont des réformes essentielles où, quelque part, seuls des modèles de partenariat pourront amener à les compétences étrangères, le capital étranger et la connaissance du terrain qui vont pouvoir faire que ça va décoller.
And what do you think the constraint to that happening is?
Je pense que c'est en train d'arriver. Je pense qu'aujourd'hui, il y a des batailles et il faut simplement se mettre... Je prends simplement l'exemple de certains pays où nous avons été très impliqués. Il y a tellement de choses à faire dans un temps si court. Je pense, Ariane l'a rappelé tout à l'heure, que l'Afrique demande son temps. Il faut que les choses se mettent en place. On est en train de passer dans une phase qui est historique à bien des égards, où il y a énormément de chantiers en parallèle, avec une puissance managériale finalement assez limitée. Tout ça doit s'étendre, ça prend un certain temps. L'important, c'est que les bonnes décisions soient mises en place, qu'on puisse commencer à exécuter aussi toutes ces stratégies, pour pouvoir commencer à en avoir tous les bénéfices. Je pense que c'est en train de se passer, ça prend simplement un certain temps.
There's the question that follows on that's come in directly for you, Mr. Oyema. Why are the banks not doing more to invest in agriculture?
Je crois d'abord qu'il faut comprendre pourquoi les banques investissent d'abord et pourquoi n'investissent pas. Il y a une question que vous avez posée tout à l'heure au niveau de l'implication des banques dans le système de financement. Le processus de financement d'une banque commence d'abord par l'épargne. Notre collègue à l'extrême droite a parlé tout à l'heure de l'implication du nouveau management, mais il faut d'abord comprendre que si nous n'avons pas l'épargne en Afrique, nous ne pourrons pas financer des investissements en Afrique. Et les investissements dans l'agriculture sont des investissements sur le long terme. Malheureusement, nous n'avons pas l'épargne très longue en Afrique. Donc, pour avoir cette épargne très longue en Afrique, il faut déjà conjuguer les mécanismes pour avoir cette épargne longue en Afrique. Et la question qu'on peut se poser aujourd'hui, où se trouve l'épargne africaine? Traditionnellement, je vais chahuter mon voisin de droite, puisque l'épargne africaine est souvent sollicitée à l'extérieur. Donc il faut que nous rentrons dans un nouveau mécanisme de faire en sorte que l'épargne de l'Afrique soit en Afrique. Dès que l'épargne en Afrique sera en Afrique, nous pourrons financer des investissements sur le long terme. Donc aujourd'hui, ce que nous faisons, on commence à financer, mais il faut qu'il y ait une adéquation entre les financements et le mode de financement, c'est-à-dire l'épargne qui doit être adaptée à ce financement-là et au produit même de financement. Donc au niveau de l'agriculture aujourd'hui, les banques commencent à s'y intéresser, mais c'est un secteur qui est nouveau pour elles. Il en est de même pour le financement de l'habitat, qui sont des secteurs nouveaux, parce que jusqu'à présent, nous avions que des banques commerciales et très peu de banques de développement. Maintenant, les banques de développement commencent aussi, elles. Nous en avons une au Gabon, qui, à notre connaissance, reste encore, je dirais, la dernière des banques de développement en Afrique, en dehors de la Banque africaine de développement en tant que telle. Mais il faut d'abord commencer par mobiliser l'épargne avant de parler de financement.
We have another question in that sort of leads from that. Apart from agricultural production, why not think of reducing exports and increasing in order to grow the domestic economy? I'm not quite sure what that question means, but perhaps you could have a go at that, Mr. Devarajan, just because the World Bank has always favored an export-orientated economic policy for Africa.
I think trying to reduce exports has got to be one of the most unproductive things we can do in Africa. Because what does that mean? That means lowering prices to farmers. That's the only way you lower export, if you think about an export tax. By the way, we've tried that in Africa for decades, and that's what's led to impoverishment of farmers. So if we want farmers to earn a return, and they are 70% of the poor, we want to encourage exports as much as possible. Let me just make one other comment on why banks aren't lending, because I looked into this in a couple of places like Mozambique. where there's almost no lending to farmers. And again, it's the fact that most farmers are smallholders. They're literally lending to individuals. And those banks aren't, and some of them are not literate, some of them have no way of maintaining a business and then being able to repay. One thing we found is training farmers on just bookkeeping actually increases their access to finance, because then they can list their assets and then the banks are willing to lend to them. So there are small things we can do that can have a big effect on credit to farmers.
If I can complement just this point about export-driven agriculture versus domestic demand, we're currently writing strategies for a number of funds in agriculture, looking at the opportunities in the sector. And guess what? The single most important opportunity coming out of this is definitely African cities. Feeding African cities with high-value agriculture. Veggies, fruits, everything related actually to this emerging middle class in African cities. There are already 52 cities in Africa with more than 1 million inhabitants. This number is going to grow to 75 in the next few years. And if you think about the supply chain challenge related to actually bringing to this middle class that can afford protein, that can afford milk, that can afford poultry, all those value chains are actually extremely interesting. And given the logistics challenges of actually getting the stuff out, actually this is the single best return on investment. Here again, I would not oppose export-driven agriculture, and there is enough, let's say, space, enough workforce to actually provide all, let's say, outlets. The real issue in agricultural development is going to be how to structure those sectors. This has to do with industry structure. How do you aggregate the smallholding farms? How do you create fair models that allow actually the greatest number of smallholding farms to access those market opportunities, which are there today?
We have another question in for you, Shanta. How can Africa retain locally a bigger share of its GDP? I guess this is a question about capital flight and why so much capital is still exiting the continent.
Well, if you want to talk about capital flight, the reason for capital flight is that capital finds a higher rate of return outside Africa than in Africa. So the way to retain the capital in Africa is to increase the rate of return that capital can get in the continent, which again comes back to what we've all talked about, improving the regulatory framework, improving the policy framework, improving the credibility of economic policies in the country. And you do find that when that happens, capital does start coming into the country. You know, today, Africa gets over $50 billion in private capital flows. That's more than foreign aid. So this is happening, but it needs to happen more.
Capital flight, on the other hand, is still extremely high, and over the last decade has grown enormously, which sort of belies the whole story of Africa rising, in a sense.
Well, as I said, but that's because it is still the case that people feel that there are better rates of return to be had and safer havens outside the country, and then there's a part of it that is illegal. And let's be honest, that it's capital that is hiding from its rightful owners.
There's a sense you get from a lot of the reports that have come out about this, about the performance of the continent in the last decade, that improved governance is almost inevitable. But in fact, if you look around the place, there's a very mixed picture in many different countries. There have been democratic reversals. There have been a lot of slippage in some countries. What do you think about that? Perhaps you could answer that, Colin.
Look, as I said earlier, I think there is directionally a very positive development. I mean, the fact is that there's hardly a country that doesn't have a multi-party democracy in Africa today. And people are electing their leaders, and there are much more transparent, visible political processes that lead to the governments being elected. The question, again, is whether the institutions of the government are implementing in a visible and transparent way their programs in a way that ultimately holds them accountable. I happen to think on the previous question that there may be an element of corrupt earned capital leaving for flight reasons to get hidden away in bank accounts elsewhere. But there's a lot of it that has to do with just where is the opportunity to invest the capital. And if you look at it, $800 billion of market capitalization in South Africa. The next largest stock exchange is the Nigeria Stock Exchange with $40 billion, of which one company is held 97% by one individual. And so the question is, what if you're an African and you want to invest outside of South Africa and be able to trade your stocks, how liquid are those positions? And so I think one of the priorities really for Africa, and particularly countries like Angola, Nigeria, and so on, in improving the governance and improving the options for people to indigenize investing, is to create functional, liquid equity capital markets. And so, for example, companies like Unitel, Sonangol, these kind of companies in Angola, if they were to list 4 or 5 of these companies, suddenly you would have an active stock market in Angola. That would make a difference. Over time, you've got to start somewhere. And so I think that the more that companies do that, the better. Let me give you one example of something that was very positively done, I think. In Angola, the government has insisted that all multinational oil companies have to use deposit-taking, they have to deposit cash balances in local Angolan banks. And what this means is a massive flood of cash into the local Angolan banks, which will make sure that those Angolan banks have to manage the money, it'll grow their balance sheets, it'll become a self-fulfilling situation where the banking system in Angola will benefit from the oil flows. And it's that sort of regulatory involvement that I think is going to help Africa move forward in a way that China did from very little, and look where they are today.
Clearly, Angola is drawing in investment despite some shortcomings in governance. Here's a question from the audience. How can risks be mitigated so that investment goes to the lower growth, more volatile places so that it contributes to growth and stability? Maybe you could answer that one, Ariane.
Going to lower growth countries, I think, to rebound on what Amin said, what's very interesting in Africa for us private equity investors is to choose the people, choose the sectors in which you want to invest, and create long-lasting alliances. And most of our investments have been more than 15 years with the same people, and we help them go into other countries. An example, for example, is a Namibian who has service factories in Namibia and wants to move in Zambia and other countries with, for example, a hotel chain. That for us is a very interesting model because we accompany them as a bank almost, and that to us, as long as we are solid, we have a solid partner, we don't see a problem moving into less solid countries. In Africa, what's really important, beside the regulation, is having very solid partnerships because it's still a very, very young market. And it's a continent, with which you need people. So you need the people in Africa that will supervise your investments because I can't supervise them out of Europe. But that's what makes we have had amazing returns and very solid investments based on certain sectors, but mostly really good partnerships.
But clearly going forward, one of the big risks for the continent is going to be derived from the unequal distribution of wealth, both within countries and between countries. And there's a danger that some countries will attract a lot of investment and will grow fast, others will be left behind.
But that's why I'm very interested to follow people that look at Africa, that African people that look at Africa in a whole. I am fully aware there are different speeds in Africa, but you do want to encourage investments in more difficult countries because otherwise, yes, you will increase this gap. And yes, you will only invest in relatively solid countries. And the real challenge is how do you go into more difficult countries feeling comfortable about it? Because at the end, you have to succeed in your investment. As you said at the beginning, I mean, failure investment makes it all the more difficult. But that's for us, at least for us, a way to go in poorer countries. Because you do want to go into those countries. Because as you said, you cannot tolerate this, widening gap between some countries and others, and between some region and others, and you do want to spread wealth. It was very fantastic to have commodities pushing up these economies, but you want to encourage non-commodity economies. And it's important, again, to say that commodities account for 25% of the economy, not the entire economy. And I'm interested in going in those other sectors because I think you have to create a wider economy in these countries to make them stronger.
Just also comment on this. I think it's true that there is the potential for an unequal development across the continent. But there's also very promising signs. I'll give you one example. East Africa looked for a while like it could get left behind. West Africa with the oil development and the populations and the size of the GDPs of those countries. Now, Uganda found oil, and the Chinese, through CNOOC and Total, bought into that oil field on the Ugandan lake, and they paid $2.5 billion. It was reported some weeks ago that closed. And if you look at that project, just for example, there is going to have to be several $billions of investment in infrastructure to deliver and develop that oil infrastructure, which is going to absolutely transform Uganda. There's no doubt about it, and Uganda and Tanzania, Kenya will benefit from either the pipeline, the refinery, or whatever form of infrastructure is ultimately decided upon between all the parties there. The combination of that, together with the Indians flowing their investment, for example, Bharti Zain through Kenya, GE's headquarters for Africa is in Kenya. Various Indian companies have historical linkages with East Africa. So East Africa is suddenly looking a lot more interesting as a place for momentum than it was in the past. And if you have a look at Angola with the Brazilians and the oil companies, Nigeria in and of itself, the Chinese all across the continent, 1 million Chinese living across the continent, and the South Africans pushing up right through the continent. There's a combination of domestic reforms and a combination of other influences, multinational and other agendas across the continent, which actually are helping Africa rise, more or less together. And I don't believe that, apart from the countries that are really finding it difficult to get peace and stability, those countries are tending to benefit economically.
We've got a flood of questions coming in on the iPad, but we're running out of time. And I'd like to use an old-fashioned method and just see if there's anyone out there in the audience who would like to ask a question directly to the panel. The gentleman at the back there.
I've got a question. Everybody has been talking about the success of Africa and Africa growing at 5 or 6% on average. But given that Africa is starting from a very low base, would you estimate that this growth that we are seeing is below the growth potential that Africa has to grow? I mean, should Africa not be growing at 10% instead of 5 or 6%? So I've got a question to Devarajan, who's chief economist of the World Bank. So is growth being undershot in Africa right now?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think Africa can grow at 10%. And we do have some African countries that are already doing so. Ethiopia has been growing at 10% for the last 7 years, which shows that you can. And you're absolutely right. This growth at such a low base is by no means sufficient. We need to get it up to about 10%. But frankly, for that, you need a much more buoyant global economy as well. You can't just do it within Africa.
Well, we're running to the end of our time here, and I think we've broadly reached a consensus that there's a huge amount of potential for Africa to continue growing over the next period. There may be a few obstacles too. But I'd like to put a question to the audience. is the rise of Africa a reality or a myth? And it would be great if you could vote using your phones. And we'll see the result shortly, hopefully, on the screen, if anyone is voting. I can't see anyone voting, but there's a hand up, but I think you have to use the new technology on this one. So hopefully, in a moment, we'll see on the screen behind us the answer.
No one is voting.
And there's unfortunately no more time for questions. I'm sure there will be many panels in the next couple of days which will go into more detail into some of the issues we've raised. I was told this was going to take 10 to 15 seconds, but clearly it may take longer. So thank you very much to all the panel, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.